Hi, I'm Josh, here to talk about my 2025 reading year in review. I intend to make two more similar videos, one for my board games of 2025 and one for my video games of 2025, but we're going to focus on the books today. And I guess one good thing about following up the absolutely atrocious reading year that was 2024 is it can't really get much worse than that, because in 2024 I only read 6 books and my average rating of those 6 books was 5.67 out of 10. So definitely a pretty abysmal reading year in 2024. 2025 wasn't great either, but it was better than that. I read a total of 10 books in 2025, which is not up to my prime reading years of 21 to 23, where I was reading a half-decent number of books for me anyways. I'm not a fast reader, and certainly not up into those high numbers that a lot of booktubers do, but 10 books in 2025, not super great. I'm going to talk about the average ratings here in a second, but I did stop tracking individual book acquisitions and book on hauls. If you did if you did watch my video that I made towards the end of 2025 about the big book on haul I did, you'll see that in general I'm trying to downsize and simplify. So at that point I had tried to offload about 75 books. I successfully sold roughly half of them to an independent used bookstore and downsized my book collection that way. So overall I certainly offloaded a lot more books than I acquired in 2025, which is a trend that I would love to continue as I continue to try to simplify, declutter, downsize, and overall live a simpler lifestyle that is less focused on stuff in general. So instead of doing a best of and a worst of, because there's only 10 books, I'll just go through them in order of my lowest rating to my highest rating. And I would say that 4 of these 10 are kind of fall within the disappointment category, so maybe they would be the worst of the year. And then the other 6 are at least rated 7 out of 10 or higher. So as I get through this list, we'll get into the best of when I hit that point. And I will state that I do have a detailed video review for every single one of these books or series that I'm going to be mentioning here. So if you do want to hear more about my thoughts about these individual books, feel free to look up those videos if you want. Also, there is one genre that has been quite abysmal this year. I wonder if you can guess what genre that is before I get into this list here. I will talk about genres individually once I go through these 10 books, but let's start off with my worst book of the year, which was Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings, a fantasy book that was first published in 1982, a book that I rated 2 out of 10. I felt particularly bad because this was a gift from one of my viewers of the channel, and so, you know, I really felt kind of bad bashing this book so much and giving it such a low rating, but I'm just always going to be honest and not worry too much about what people think of me. So that was my worst of the year. Next up, we have a book called Johannes Cabal the Necromancer by Jonathan L. Howard, published in 2009, which I had rated 3 out of 10, a steampunk book that I also had read, and the next one in the same series, and it's the next one in this list, called Johannes Cabal the Detective, again by Jonathan L. Howard. This one published in 2010, and I rated that one a 4.5 out of 10. So 2 books that just did not work for me very well at all. Going up to a science fiction book, now we have Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes, a book published in 1966 that I rated 5 out of 10. It had some really cool themes, but things that I really did not like at the same time, so I ended up with this sort of middle-of-the-road rating. And that is my 4 disappointments of the year. Now we'll get into the best of the year for me. And leading us there is Leonard and Hungry Paul by Ronan Hessian, published in 2019, a book that I rated 7 out of 10, and just a simple, fun literary fiction novel that I enjoyed. Moving to nonfiction next, we have Underland, A Deep Time Journey by Robert McFarlane, first published in 2019, that I rated 7.5 out of 10. This was a really interesting combination of science, nonfiction, travelogue, philosophy, environmentalist, poetic almost, a whole mix and match of a whole bunch of different genres in one really interesting book. We go to a trilogy next because in general, when I talk about book series, if they are all telling the same story, regardless of whether they're published in 1, 2, 3 or more books, I typically will rate them as all one individual story. So we have the Regeneration Trilogy by Pat Barker, which consists of the books Regeneration, The Eye in the Door, and The Ghost Road, which was completed in 1995 with the publication of The Ghost Road. I rated this trilogy an 8 out of 10. This is a historical fiction series that looks at the First World War through the eyes of a psychiatrist in particular who is studying the effects of what we now know as PTSD, what was then called shell shock. And then finally, my very best book of the year was a collection of speeches that was published in a book called If This Isn't Nice, What Is? The Graduation Speeches and Other Words to Live by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. And this was published in 2024, although Kurt Vonnegut Jr. died in 2007, so these are older speeches and writings of his that were collected and published in this book, and I rated a perfect 10 out of 10, as I do with, I think, every other book that is a collection of Kurt Vonnegut Jr.'s speeches and essays and general nonfiction musings on life. So those were the individual books ranked. Now, if we break them down by genre, we have not a lot of difference because I didn't read typically more than 1 or 2 books in a genre. So when I look at the book genres, I'll go in order of the lowest rated to the highest rated. And we have an extremely disappointing fantasy genre coming out at the bottom of the pack with 3 fantasy books, one of which falls into the category of classic fantasy, 2 of which fall into the steampunk subclassification, and my overall average rating of those 3 fantasy novels was an abysmal 3.17 out of 10, and that's just a continuation of a bad couple of years in the fantasy genre, because over the past 2 years, well, including 2024 and 2025, I have read 8 books that fall within the speculative fiction category, which consists of generally fantasy, sci-fi, steampunk, all that sort of stuff. And of the 8 books I've read over the past 2 years that fall within that fantasy fiction category, only 1 has been rated higher than 5.5 out of 10. So it's just been having a terrible couple of years trying to find good fantasy novels. It's frustrating because I do want to find fantasy that takes me away to wonderful worlds and that gives me that escapism that I'm looking for, but I've just been having a terrible time finding it in the past couple of years. As a result, at the beginning of 2026, the first book I read was a return to an old author who I can generally count on for writing good fantasy, so I'll get to that whenever I get through this series of videos for my 2025 wrap-up. But moving on to the next book genre, we have just a single science fiction book, which I rated 5 out of 10, Flowers for Algernon. My 1 literary fiction, Leonard and Hungry Paul, was a 7 out of 10. My 3 historical fiction novels were all within the same trilogy of books, and that was an 8 out of 10. And then, as often happens, my highest rated genre for the year was nonfiction, which consisted of 1 science book and 1 collection of speeches, and those 2 ratings averaged out to 8.75 out of 10. So yeah, I tend to really get a lot out of the nonfiction books that I read, but I don't want to read just nonfiction books. I do enjoy fiction quite a lot, and so that's why I tend to mix up the 2, try to do a combination of nonfiction and fiction reading. So how does the quality of these 10 books stack up in comparison to other years when I average out all of the ratings of the 10 books? And, well, when I do so, it falls literally right in the middle of the past 5 years. I've only really been rating books, I think, for 5 years now. So my total average for 2025 was 6.3 out of 10, which, as I said, was both the 3rd worst and 3rd best of the 5 years that I've been tracking my average ratings. When I average out all my averages of the past 5 years, so my average rating, or my average rating of all books read over the past 5 years, I get 6.5 out of 10. So this rating of 6.3 out of 10 represents plunking right down, pretty much right on top of that average, although it's slightly under that. I would love to be reading better quality books that rate higher than that for me, but I guess I'm just too damn picky, or I'm just bad at picking books that work really well for me. So I'll keep trying to do better in 2026, and we'll see how it goes. Certainly my reading quantity is affected by certain factors, such as how many TV shows or movies I happen to be watching, because most of my reading happens at bedtime. A little bit happens when I'm picking up my kids from school and waiting to pick them up, but generally the largest amount happens when I'm in bed in the evening. And so if I'm watching a TV show or movie instead, that will take away from my reading. If I'm doing a fair bit of video gaming, that might eat up into my reading time as well. So that definitely accounts for the lower numbers over the past couple of years, is the fact that I've been doing more video gaming, more TV and movie watching. And in the past, I would say a lot of that bedtime reading was board game rule books, but because I'm not having to read a lot of board game rule books in recent years, I can switch the focus to my book reading a little bit. And I'd like to do a little bit more reading and spend a bit more focus on reading rather than on screen. So we'll see how that goes in 2026. I will definitely keep you in touch. How was 2025 for you as a reading year? What was your favorite book you read in 2025? I would love to hear about it. Please do let me know, and I just really appreciate you watching. Cheers. Now, to start off with my worst book of the year, we have a fantasy... The